So to start off, Beth and Andrew, I want to kind of ask you a very general framing question. On a scale of 1 to 10, how would you rate the fiscal health of the United States? 1 being it's the worst it's ever been. We're on the brink of financial collapse. Everybody put your cash under your mattresses and get your food storage and just get ready. And 10 being, well, it's the best it's ever been. We have nothing to worry about. Our fiscal and financial health is great. Where would you put the United States today? Beth, let's start with you.
I'm going to go out on a limb and say we're at about a 4. I think there are a lot of things that we should be concerned about, a lot of the things that the congressman spoke about previously. The fact that we're running record deficits and on track to have interest be the single largest line item in our budget by 2050. Those are concerning trajectories and things that I think open up a lot of uncertainty about where we're headed. That said, when we study macroeconomics, we are in the unfortunate position of not having, lots and lots of experiments about what happens when you run deficits to this. And so there's still some uncertainty of where that would lead us. And I think that's what would, prevent me from giving us a worse score, despite the fact that a lot of the conversation we just had was about doom and gloom statistics.
Andrew, agree, different rating?
Yeah, mostly I agree.
Sorry.
Yeah, I'd say mostly I agree. I was gonna, maybe say like a 5-ish. At its current level, short term, am I worried that we're suddenly just going to, fall off a financial cliff? No, but the trajectory is what I'm worried about. The consistent deficits, like the congressman was saying, this is more of the problem. The overall amount of debt that is out there, we've seen that markets can handle this amount of debt that is currently out there. It's where we're going from here that concerns me.
So lest you all think we're just going to be pessimistic the whole time, we'll talk through some of the challenges as those ratings aren't glowing, but also there's probably some room for optimism. So we'll talk about what to be optimistic about as well as maybe some potential solutions to some of this. But first, to continue, there's a now famous quote from Thomas Sowell where he says, "There are no solutions, only trade-offs." And I want to ask both of you about that in terms of debates over government spending are often framed as kind of very extreme either or. Either we must pass this latest and greatest spending package. It's going to spend a lot of money and do a lot of great things for Americans. And if you don't pass it, it's going to be really, really bad for the American people. And then on the other hand, people are saying, well, we can't spend another single dollar. We just have to cut as aggressively as we can. And perhaps the nature of our politics, a little bit of polarization there. But given that framing of the way these debates usually go, what do you think gets missed in terms of trade-offs? When we're talking about spending government dollars or cutting spending, what should voters and our folks in the room and watching the video, what should they understand and keep in mind about the trade-offs component of these decisions? Andrew?
Yeah, this is something that I talk with my students about a lot, is when we're talking about some of these different topics, it is so hard to separate the policy from the politics, right? There is, when we're talking about policy, we have to consider the trade-offs. If we're talking about cutting government spending, there's a lot of people who say that there's too much wasteful government spending. Really what we mean is that there's government spending that probably doesn't give us the bang for our buck that we need. But we need to understand that there are people on the other side of that spending as well. And we need to make sure that when we're cutting spending, when we're changing the tax code, that we are impacting families, we are impacting businesses, and that there is no one clear-cut solution to this problem, and there probably never will be. This is what makes policymaking difficult. It's about weighing those options.
I just promised the audience solutions, so we're going to try and figure that out better by the end. I'm just kidding. Beth, what do we need to keep in mind in terms of trade-offs?
Yeah, so you might guess, because of my affiliations, I'm not a huge Bernie Sanders fan, but there was a moment several years ago where I gained a lot of respect for him. I actually got to be in the room for a debate between him and Senator Ted Cruz, and they were talking about healthcare generally, and someone challenged him to say, essentially, this is going to cost a lot of money. You're not going to actually make, welfare greater because you're costing a lot of money. And he said, in his kind of grumpy way, he said, yeah, it's going to cost money. And I want to live in a world where people have access to healthcare. And I thought, bravo, we're talking about the trade-offs. And I thought that's something that I can actually appreciate because that is recognizing that in order to give up one thing, we're getting, giving up one thing in order to get another thing. And that's often not the way that things are characterized in these discussions. Over the past several years especially, there has been an emergence of this discussion of the notion of modern monetary theory. And I don't know how long this has been in existence. I just know that it's been in the newspapers for several years now. And it's essentially this idea that we can kind of print money and magically face no constraints on what we can spend. It's a lot more complex than that. I'm sort of being a little bit patronizing and describing it so simply, but that's essentially the idea that there are no limits to what we can spend, or they're, just far beyond the status quo. And I think that's what's wrong. It's that the fact that we are not facing any constraints, and therefore the framework of thinking about things with trade-offs is just absent from the discussion. So I applaud any time our politicians will step forward and say they recognize the trade-offs, but feel that the trade-offs that they're advocating for are in line with the values that they have.
It seems that that's an important point to emphasize and can probably be applied to a lot of policy conversations. When we talk about education, for example, that's an area where there's a lot of discussion about how much money goes into the system. It maybe sounds like what you're saying is that let's have some discussion about what the benefits are. So when we're talking about any bill before Congress, or even probably here at the state legislature that's going to spend X number of dollars, let's not forget, and let's maybe play up a little bit the emphasis of what will actually be the result of this, and not just focus on the dollar amount.
Yeah, exactly. An issue that I've studied quite intensely is student loans, which is a big issue at the moment. And President Biden initially proposed a cancellation plan that would cost $500 billion to just wipe away the student debt. And, when you look at very narrowly, you think well, yeah, everyone who's going to have their debt canceled is going to be better off because they don't have to make those payments. And there's probably a lot of sympathetic folks in this room who may have some student debt in a few years to be paying off. But then when you think about the fact that this is either $500 billion that needs to be raised in taxes, or $500 billion that can't be spent on other programs, particularly programs that might be more targeted towards those who are in poverty relative to those who are among a relatively privileged class by having gone to college, then you can kind of question the wisdom of that, even though in a very narrow perspective, it's very clear that the people who benefit will be made better off by the program. So I think it's just encouraging people to expand the lens they're using to think about these problems. Economists tend to be like-minded in these things. I was part of a podcast recently on NPR where they had a supposedly liberal economist and myself as the conservative economist, and lo and behold, we agreed on something. And in fact, it's largely because we tend to emphasize this framework of thinking about things in trade-offs. And it's remarkably absent from discourse in Washington and in state capitals as well.
Yeah, one thing that always strikes me when kind of listening to the political discourse is, we often kind of make perfect the enemy of the good, right? If we're talking about something like government debt and the deficits, we're not going to solve this, right? This is swinging for the fences. And if you've ever seen, one of a little kid swing for the fences in a baseball game, right? I mean, their eyes are closed, they're swinging as hard as they can, and what happens? They whiff. Right? The bill doesn't pass. You're trying to solve everything at one time, and you think it's this perfect solution. But in the end, nothing ends up happening. And a bill that doesn't pass is just as good, honestly, as a terrible bill that doesn't pass. So, to me, it's, we need to think incrementally. We need to think, how can we at least get, make steps towards those solutions.
So the congressman mentioned kind of that idea of incrementalism as well. Is that, I'll take something that moves us in the right direction, even if it isn't getting all the way there all at once. And I want to get into that and think through again sort of what are some of the solutions to this. But before we get there, real quick, let's give the audience kind of a quick primer, kind of a 101 overview. When the federal government actually goes out to issue debt and spend beyond what's currently allocated, how does that actually work? Because, Andrew, when we talked previously, there's a lot that goes on in terms of the financial markets when the government sells bonds. So just help our folks understand just the functionality of that, what does it look like? Because that's something that also impacts the economic health of the nation.
Sure. So really, you start with the newest legislation, whether it's an increase in spending, decrease in taxes, whatever. You're going to need to borrow some more money. So Congress and the president tell the Treasury, say, hey, go borrow money. And they turn to, they have an advisory board, and they say, okay, we have different types of debt that we can issue. We have short-term debt, we have longer-term debt. What do you need? And really, that's a testament to the fact that, we look at the debt as something that the government's going to owe, but the reason the government pays such a low interest rate is because there is demand for those pieces of paper. They represent liquidity. They represent flexibility in financial markets. Longer-term bonds are often used as savings vehicles, not only for people here in the U.S. but internationally. So there is a function that these assets play in the financial markets. Again, one of those trade-offs that if you were to dramatically reduce that, you're taking that liquidity, you're taking some of that safety out of those financial markets. So they talk to them, and then they actually have to go out and sell these bonds. Now, we basically make them sell them out into the private market, where they have to take the market interest rates. And so that's why, even though we're raising interest rates now, they don't still pay zero interest rates. They're still having to pay those market interest rates. So it is definitely them working through the markets, but also working in tandem with the markets to make sure, because the Treasury's goal is to help fund the government at the lowest possible cost, and that requires them to work with the markets to provide these assets. I mean, really, we talk about debt in a certain way, but that is a tool, and just like any other tool, I can use it to gain efficiency. I can, use it in a way that helps me do my job better, or I could lose a limb if I don't use it properly. And these things are, we can think of them in those terms as well. So really, it's a Treasury taking their cue from Congress and the president and saying, okay, let's issue some debt. What kinds of debt are we going to issue? How long is the maturity going to be? Who are we going to sell it to? Who wants these things? And so that's kind of the general overview of how that process works.
So given that framework, Beth, I want to ask you, in your role as an economist, and you kind of work in both the economics world and the public policy world, given the work that AEI does, what would you say if someone said, okay, I'm introducing a bill tomorrow that's going to say, from now on, we are spending $0 above what we currently can in terms of our debt load. So essentially, if the federal government said, no more debt at all, no more spending, we're not going to issue any more bonds. If that were to happen suddenly, do you have any insight into what that would do to financial markets, to the economy? Is there kind of a place for government debt, maybe the way that Andrew's saying, that it can be a tool, it does play a role, but maybe it's just a little bit out of control now to where it should be?
Yeah, I mean, having the ability to finance spending beyond the means of the Treasury is critical to the functioning of the economy. We have lots of people in the United States that are only able to survive because of the benefit of spending that comes out of the Treasury through different programs, through military expenditures or Social Security, things like that. Absent the ability to borrow, we would be crippling those programs and potentially hamstring a lot of people in a way that could be really damaging to them. So, I don't think that's the mechanism that we want to put in place. I mean, that's sort of the discussion with the debt ceiling that we had previously. We want to maintain the ability to run deficits. I think we want to manage spending through more thoughtful legislative practices rather than through any sort of artificial constraints.
So you mentioned the debt ceiling. Let's talk about that a little bit and kind of round out this portion of the conversation, talking about some of the problems or challenges that we're seeing. And then for the last 15 minutes or so, we'll talk about solutions, and then we'll have some time for audience Q&A and discussion as well. So the debt ceiling specifically, starting with you, Beth, and then you, Andrew, give us kind of a sense of why that is now recently such a contentious debate every time. It seems like the frequency and the intensity with which the debt ceiling is something we hear about on the national news, and there's a big fight, and it's very dramatic and kind of down to the wire. Can you help us understand what's driving those fights? Is it philosophical disagreements over spending? Is it kind of political polarization? Derek and the congressman spoke about polarization. That's been one of the consistent themes of our whole series, just because it impacts so many issues. But give us a sense from your perspective of what's driving those debt ceiling debates, and should we be thinking about it differently?
I think we should absolutely be thinking about it differently. I absolutely can't stand that we're having this debate over and over, and I'm sure Andrew is going to agree with me on that. This is a political issue. It's not a policy issue. It's not about economics. I like to think it's sort of like, maybe my household runs on credit cards, right? And we have some outstanding debt from month to month, and we realize at some point our expenses are such that we need to outspend what is the credit limit on our card. This is sort of an arbitrary threshold, in this case set by the credit card company, or in the case of the debt limit set by legislators. And so I can call my credit card company and raise that threshold and continue to be able to make the payments on things I have already committed to spend on. And that's not really a decision about spending. It's not really philosophical about how I'm choosing to spend my resources or how to budget or prioritize spending. The same is true for the debt ceiling debate. This is really just a political tool that's a chip that has become a chip to use in broader political negotiations. And the challenge, maybe Andrew can talk about this, is that even though it's a political construct that is not based in any economic fundamentals, it has potentially serious implications for financial markets and the economy. And so while it is this thing that exists in my political realm, it has potential consequences. Maybe Andrew wants to talk about those.
Every time this comes around, I have students ask me if, what will happen if the U.S. government, if Congress just decides not to raise the debt limit and we have to default on payments, we have to start picking and choosing who we're going to actually pay. And honestly, I don't know. That is something that I can't fathom how bad of a situation we would find ourselves in if that type of thing tended to happen. I mean, thinking about what what those securities, those assets out there represent. I mean, so many other financial assets are, their interest rates are derived from the rates on short-term government debt, right? That is the safest, most liquid debt that's out there. Anything that is a little less liquid uses that as its baseline, adds some interest rate. Anything that is a little less safe, take that safe rate, add some interest rates. If that goes away, it's like suddenly we lose the magnetic field around the earth, right? And suddenly compasses don't work. We don't know how to navigate properly in the financial markets. It's just one of those things that I don't know what would happen. The potential outcomes are vast. None of them are good. So that's why we talk about the difference between the politics and the policy. The policy takes those trade-offs into consideration, says you have to continue to raise the debt ceiling. And really, the debt ceiling might even be reformulated in a way that matches economic growth. Because we think about even just these non-discretionary programs, they're going to naturally grow with the size of the economy. But the debt ceiling is just a fixed dollar amount. So changing up something like that so where maybe we don't hit that debt ceiling as often, we don't have these moments as often unless we really start to engage in borrowing above and beyond the growth of the economy, I think would probably be a better way to at least go about that. If it was just me, I'd eliminate the debt ceiling. Not saying that I want a ton of debt, but just I get tired of the political debate, the brinksmanship every time this happens. And if we just got rid of that, really not a whole lot would change, but we'd all probably sleep a little better at night.
Let me add something. I just want to add to that too. I mean, even the game, we've never gotten to the place of having to test this, which is why we don't know what will happen. But I will say even the game of getting close to it has actually been largely disruptive to financial markets. And I think in the last instance, it was less disruptive than it had been in the past, perhaps because players in the market are starting to realize this is just a game and nothing is actually going to come of it. But the fact that the stock market goes haywire in anticipation of a potential default is actually concerning. A lot of people's livelihoods are dependent on the stock market, even though we very often like to remind people that the stock market is not the economy. It's not, but a lot of people's day-to-day lives depend on the stock market. And so to create this unnecessary instability in financial markets just for the sake of maintaining this political string that can be pulled at different moments in time is really, I think, irresponsible.
Well, and it sounds like too, if we think in terms of giving the audience something tangible and practical that they can use as a voter when they're talking to their elected officials, when we're thinking about these issues on the news, to the extent that there is or should be philosophical debate, shouldn't it be when those spending decisions are being made, when the appropriations bill is rolling through Congress? Maybe that's a better place from a policy standpoint for folks to take a stand and say, no, we don't want to spend beyond our debt. And if we say yes to all these bills throughout the year, that's going to force us to raise the debt limit. Is that too simple of a solution to just say, hey, have these debates when you're passing appropriations bills rather than when you've already passed those and now you're dealing with a debt ceiling increase?
I think that's right. I mean, I think in any instance of policy making that involves expenditure, you want to think again back to the trade-offs. Part of the trade-offs are that would potentially demand an increase in the deficit to finance the spending. And so, voters should be aware of those consequences. In this moment, any new spending programs are necessarily going to raise the deficit. People should be aware of the scale of the deficit, the potential risks, in the uncertainty that remains with those risks, and make decisions, circumstantially around the particular spending that's being considered. And, I'm representing a conservative viewpoint today, but I'm not the most conservative of conservatives. I believe there are times when the government should be spending money. And even though there are consequences and potentially would require debt to finance that spending, that should still occur. So I think it's in the deciding on specific policies and expenditures whether or not trade-offs justify the expense.
That is a fantastic answer, Ed. I would say, just going back to an example that we used to have, and this goes back, it was a bill passed, I think, in 1990. It was called the Budget Enforcement Act. And it was just simply a bill that said, if you are going to increase the deficit, you should have something that offsets it somewhere else. So if you're going to cut taxes in this bill, you either need to cut spending somewhere or raise taxes somewhere else. Now, the enforcement mechanism behind that bill was very weak. You could call it weak, but it was really just a simple point of order. As the bill was being processed, as it was moving along the process, you would see, you could have maybe a handful of congressmen just say, hey, this doesn't satisfy this bill. And you'd have to go back to the drawing board. And if we all agreed that, it's going to increase the deficit, but we're okay with that, then it would pass. And there are some other aspects to it as well, but that's the gist of it. And I like a bill like that. I like a system in the budgetary process like that, just simply because it provides some easy guardrails to what we're seeing today. There's a few studies as well that talk about the surpluses that we used to run back in the 1990s, and says this bill was probably a big part of that, just simply because you couldn't put forth these huge spending bills or these massive tax cuts without some really easy pushback from the other side, and kind of forcing them to the table before it comes to the vote, before behind closed doors, where I like to think rational heads prevail, and not out in front of the cameras and stuff like that, where one-liners tend to rule the headlines. But something just simple, structural like that, I think would be very useful. And number two, we talk about the politics of it. Like I said, one-liners are the big thing. I am 100% behind the congressman's comment of using slides. I, as a professor, love slides. And I think just, presenting people with the information to consider those trade-offs takes the politics out of it, focuses on the policy, says, hey, I am going to vote this way, or I'm going to propose a bill that does this. Now, I know you're going to want to run around with your hair on fire, but here's why. And I think this is the best way forward. And honestly, I think this is the bill that will pass because it has more attention paid to those trade-offs.
Beth, anything to add? I mean, the Budget Enforcement Act from the 90s, is that something we ought to think about reviving or doing some iteration of today?
That's something I know less about than Andrew, but I mean, it sounds appealing. And, just from my time in Washington, I've come to understand it's very hard to take things away. Once something is in place in terms of a benefit that's being provided in any number of channels, it's almost impossible for either party to propose something that eliminates it. So I do like this construct. Well, while in theory we could just decide one day to pass legislation that cuts spending on something, independent of anything else, that doesn't happen. So even though economists like to think of people, it's kind of like operating like robots, perfectly rational, following these rules, it turns out kind of we need some nudges to get things done. And I think this may be a nudge that Congress needs in order to, potentially maintain more appropriate spending levels. So I like that idea, though I know less about it than Andrew, I think.
Well, as we're talking about it in the vein of solutions, are there other things, and maybe thinking for a moment, again, through the lens of the voter, if a voter says, hey, I care about spending too, I don't like the idea of the government running these massive deficits year after year, I'm concerned about the increasing debt load, what are some things we can equip that voter with as they go to vote, as they talk with their elected representatives, to say, here are some of the things that you, in the spirit of self-government, can be focused on that can help lead us towards solutions to the spending issue. Does anything general come to mind there?
I'm not a fan of slides, like Andrew and the congressman. I think that, most voters don't have the luxury of time to sit around and, come to the events like this and really do a deep dive on issues. And I think that, we as, public intellectuals or policymakers need to spoon feed them the information, not because they're not smart, but because they don't have the luxury of time to invest in understanding these issues. And part of that is, as we talked about previously, highlighting those trade-offs. One is, how do we explain those trade-offs? I said earlier, canceling student debt through President Biden's initially proposed plan would be $500 billion in debt. That might not mean a lot to most people who aren't typically day-to-day operating in budgets of trillions of dollars. What we could also say is that it looks like about a $3,000 per taxpayer expense. Just translating it in that way and offering a different way for voters to digest the information, I think can empower them to make decisions that are aligned with their self-interest and what their values are. So I think, that I don't want to put the onus on individuals to do, the deep dive. I think that the public, institutions, our lawmakers and representatives really need to do the homework to deliver the information, not through slides, but through talking points that are factually correct, but that resonate and that, really meet the voter where they are so that, they can connect with the information.
Andrew, anything else that you would add?
Any defensive slides?
Yeah. Defend PowerPoint.
That's a hill I will die on. I think you're absolutely right. Your comment about presenting the numbers in a way that are digestible is so important because, $400 billion just seems like I deal with these numbers all the time. I still can't wrap my head around it, but understanding it, scaling it to a way that we can really understand what's going on is I think is going to be really important because I think a lot of the political discourse, especially, loves the big numbers, loves the shock factor. Like this sounds like a massive amount of money, but really when you think about it, we talk about interest payments on the current debt load. And how it's never been larger than it is today. Well, yeah, sure, but that's also partly because the economy has grown, and it's just these are bigger programs than they used to be. And when we scale that by GDP, something like that, say, okay, out of the size of the economy, our interest payments are at about 3.5% of GDP. You can say that's a lot. Back in 1990, it was 5%. So relative to where we've been, it's maybe not as bad as some of the big numbers would suggest. And I think that brings us in from our kind of polarized world and says, okay, now we have something that says this is not good, the trajectory is bad, but it's also not the end of the world tomorrow.
So as we begin to close and then transition to audience discussion and questions, what gives you cause for optimism? What about this issue do you look at and you say, I'm not as worried as I could be. I'm hopeful, I'm optimistic there's light on the horizon. Give us a sense of why we should feel that way as well. Or are you optimistic?
I'm very optimistic, and I think really this type of event, it really is what makes me optimistic, because like we talked about at the end of the congressman's session, we're talking about these things. We understand that even if you don't think that higher debt levels are necessarily going to be horrible, we can all pretty much agree on certain basic ideas like, okay, right now it's maybe not horrible, but if we keep doing this, at some point, like, it's going to tip that scale. But at least having these trade-offs, having the potential costs on our radar, I think is so important, because voters vote with their feet. If they're going to pick the people who best represent what they think about the economy. So trying to have events like this where we're trying to get these maybe scaled numbers, right, to the people, trying to help people understand what's really going on, is a major reason to be optimistic.
I'd say the thing that makes me optimistic is, in fact, the strength of our economy. So carrying a pretty large credit card balance is not the end of the world if you have a really high-paying job. And so in the same way, as long as our economy is strong and producing, we have high GDP, unemployment is low, then we're in a good position to address this problem. We have record low unemployment right now. We're 3 years out from the COVID pandemic-induced recession, which could have been absolutely catastrophic for the economy. It ended up, in retrospect, being a blip that we effectively managed really well through policymaking. And so, we've demonstrated a lot of success and strength, resilience in the economy that I think will allow us to carry through what could potentially be a budget crisis absent that strength. So not to say we won't need to make some other changes as well, but we're on a strong footing to proceed in that way.
Optimism and the strength of the American economy is a good place to close our discussion and transition to audience Q&A. So we'll invite anyone who has a question, go ahead and raise your hand. We'll just ask you to shout it out. Who has something they'll want to ask our panelists? Please, sir.
In the early 1920s, President Calvin Coolidge cut spending about 50%. That doesn't seem to have destroyed the country. Why can't we do that now? You say it'd be devastating to have precipitous cuts in spending. Really? It didn't then. We had the Roaring 20s. So why would precipitous spending cuts destroy the country?
I'll take some.
Okay.
So again, when we think about the spending versus the revenue side, if we were to dramatically, if we were to fix this problem with dramatically raising taxes, we say, well, you're taking money out of people's pockets, right? And that's going to hurt the economy. And that's going to be. It's essentially the same. If we're cutting spending, remember, there's a person on the other end of that transaction. Whether we like what it's being spent on or not, this money is going to businesses. It's going to households. So I don't know that we would be able to do that. Also, the Roaring 20s ended in the Great Depression. So if Coolidge is cutting spending precipitously in the early 1920s, it's not that much longer after that we go through one of the worst economic spells we've ever had. So again, I think whether you're talking about spending cuts or raising taxes, trying to fix the debt issue, it's gonna be painful. Like there are, like I said, there are no solutions. There are only trade-offs. It is a situation where we have to kind of pick our battles, and we have to figure out how can we reduce the deficits. I would argue to focus on the deficits, not necessarily the debt itself, the deficits, but do it in a way that's not going to, that's going to reduce the harm to everyday Americans, to businesses. Do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I'd also add that I don't think there's anything wrong with setting a goal of massively cutting expenditures if that's in line with what your political values are. I'm not sure 50% is where I would land, but it's a fine number for you or anyone else to believe in. But I think that just logistically, you would want to do it on a slower clip. Any sort of massive disruptions can unnecessarily cause people to go into really vulnerable economic circumstances. So you imagine an industry that is supported by government expenditure, for example, through subsidies. Maybe you shut down a manufacturing plant in a particular town. If you do it slowly, over time, people can migrate, find new jobs, train in different industries so that they can become reemployed, and you minimize the disruption. If you do it abruptly, you have a mass exodus, people trying to find jobs in the surrounding communities all at the same time, and so there may be an unnecessary cost associated with the abrupt disruption in the spending. So I think it's fine to say we want to aggressively cut spending if those are your values. I think that there are reasons that we would want to do it more slowly than that.
Excellent question, sir. Thank you. Who else? What question is on your mind that you'd like to ask our panelists, please?
This is for public policy regarding student loan debt. I'm thinking it's addressing the wrong problem, because if the inflationary problem within higher education, we're not matching earning power to the cost of education. So no loan officer worth their salt would invest in an individual for a degree that will not support that debt. And that is a missing component, in my opinion, of the issuance of loans to people to go to college. And every time they raise tuition, the government raises how much they'll loan by a direct proportion. So could you speak to the public policy regarding how to address that? Because if we leave it as it is, in a few years, we're going to be back for giving another $500 billion in debt, and we're not addressing that fully.
That's exactly right, and something that I argue very often, that by canceling student debt, we're eliminating a symptom of a problem rather than addressing the problem at its core. Part of the solution is addressing value. Historically, we know that the boost in access to wages more than offsets the cost of enrollment, even though it's high. The latest estimates suggest that a bachelor's degree is worth about $1 million in extra earnings over the course of your lifetime. Most people are not spending $1 million on their college degree, so therefore, on average, people are doing actually quite well with this investment. The New York Fed estimates that it's approximately a 15% internal rate of return. So if instead of putting your money into a college degree, you put it into the stock market, it would be like getting a 15% rate of return because of the extra earnings that you get. Everything that's backward looking says college degrees are worth it. So the fact that we were lending for those degrees is actually not super problematic. The problem is the trend, of course, and that we're on an upward trajectory where inflation in higher education exceeds inflation in any other major sector of the economy. So if we continue on that path, continue with the subsidies that are allowing that inflation to continue, we will ultimately get to a place where people are spending more for degrees than they're worth. I think that the missing piece is that we are not imposing accountability on institutions, which says that you need to deliver for your students in order to continue to get access to those student loans. Recently, Republicans in Congress have been energized on higher education policy, which is a great thing because they have historically kind of been on the sidelines, and this has been an issue that's led by Democrats. One of the pieces that was proposed in new legislation by Republicans would have institutions needing to prove that their graduates were out earning a particular level of income in order to maintain access to the lending program. So that's not exactly underwriting like we see underwriting for cars or for homes, but it's a huge step in the right direction. And that is only handing out debt for institutions or for programs of study that are proving or can prove with their historical data that they're offering a return on investment for their students. So I like that idea. It's a notion that's known as accountability in Washington, and there's a lot of discussion about how to impose that on the higher ed industry. Higher industry has a very strong lobby, and so there's a lot of pushback in Washington on making that happen. But I'm optimistic that the moment is right. There's enough people who are upset about the issue that we could see some action.
I would just like a follow-up, anecdotally for my experience. I came here for my undergraduate here at Reber, and I worked my way through school, and I ended up with $2,500 in student debt at the end, which I was able, with the master's, to pay off. And I don't see people being able to do that now. They can't support themselves through. They have to because of the level of tuition while they're going to school.
That's right.
They can't work their way through school.
No, they can't. And
I think that's a problem.
Yeah, legislators love during hearings to say, when I went to college, I paid for it with a part-time job and, being a lifeguard in the summer. I mean, if I had $1 for every time I've heard that in DC. But, but it's true. And it's very much true. And there's a wonderful study out of the Urban Institute, actually, which demonstrates that. It looks at what was, what you could potentially earn a generation ago using part-time employment and summer work. Relative to the cost of enrollment and what you can earn today, and it's just simply not possible. There aren't enough hours in the day for you to work the number of hours that you need in order to pay for your enrollment. So it's absolutely the case. There have been fundamental shifts. I don't believe that it's necessarily true that education isn't worth it anymore. I think that for the most part, people are still getting a good deal even when they're paying a high price tag, but I'm very concerned about the direction that we're going.
Andrew, is there anything you wanted to add on the student loan and college question, or?
I am absolutely worthless in this type of discussion about this particular policy. So I'm gonna leave it at that.
Not worthless. But we'll ask for other questions. Who else in the audience? Anything on your mind for our two panelists? Anything regarding debt, deficit, and things we talked about today? Don't want to shortchange anyone. If you have something burning you want to mention, please.
There's been a lot of conversation about the deficit and taxes, and I wanted to ask Congressman Moore, but apparently he has to leave. My question, which I've never quite understood, is the 2017 tax cuts raised $7+ trillion in debt since those tax cuts were implemented. So why can't we raise taxes on the wealthy, have a more marginal average tax rate for everybody, cancel out that deficit increase?
That is a great question. Thank you. How do I approach this? Yeah, no, that's absolutely right. And this is, I mentioned the Budget Enforcement Act that said, hey, if you're going to have a big bill that cuts taxes dramatically, you need to find a way to offset it. Again, if someone opposes this type of bill, but I joke with my students sometimes, like, I don't mind if you want to put, higher tax rates on people making over $1 million. Like, I'm never going to sniff that amount, so it's okay with me. But I think that there's definitely a lot of room to have that discussion of, hey, we're going to cut taxes here. We need to, that's going to add to the debt. How do we fix that? Do we cut spending somewhere? Do we raise taxes somewhere else? It's always interesting to me to think about taxes, because we tax things that we like, right? We tax things that we consider to be good. We tax income, right? We tax profits. We tax, all of these different types of things. And that's a disincentive to do those things. So finding a way to try to mitigate the potential costs of those taxes while understanding the benefits that the government does provide with that money. Is really important. But I think your question absolutely is right. Part of that, this polarization is that we end up with, one side wants massive tax cuts, the other side wants increased spending. So we compromise, we say yes to all, and we end up with big debt. But having a more nuanced discussion about the potential costs and actual, say there's no solutions. Actual solutions, considering those trade-offs is so important. I think you're absolutely right there. That time?
Well, I think basically where I get stuck is like, why should a billionaire pay less taxes than a teacher? That's where I was wanting to ask Mr. Moore, but I'll ask him in another forum. Thank you.
I'll offer a quick reply to that. I'm not saying this is my position. I'll tell you that somebody who would defend that might say, well, the billionaire is actually creating lots of jobs, and the teacher is playing a role in society, but maybe it's not at the scale of the jobs that are being created by the billionaire. So, where exactly is the line? What should the ratio of tax, be on billionaires versus teachers? I don't know. And I'm not an expert on tax, nor do I, have specific beliefs about this. But I think that's the nature of the debate that you would get into when you think about those sorts of decisions.
Okay.
To that end, a teacher can deduct up to $300 a year if she pays for school supplies, which is a whole other conversation about why teachers have to do that. A billionaire can deduct a yacht or a private jet. It doesn't quite make sense.
I'm not going to. I'm not defending it.
So we'll.
But I was just giving you the notion of what I think people who might defend it might suggest.
And great questions, and this is why these discussions are so important. And we're talking about trade-offs and how that impacts people at different levels of the economy. And so I want to thank all of you for your questions and comments. The last thing that we'll leave with for our panelists, this is our final question, in very, very brief answers. You find yourself in an elevator with Joe Biden, Chuck Schumer, and Kevin McCarthy. And they say, hey, Beth, Andrew, I saw that panel. You guys did really great. What should we do on deficits? You got 30 seconds before they get off the elevator. What do you do? Beth, we'll start with you, and then Andrew will give you the last word.
I say let's be honest about the trade-offs involved with policy so that voters can make decisions for themselves.
Andrew.
Oh, that's general. I had something a little bit more specific. Mine's regarding, I've always thought a good way to think about like something like Social Security, right? Someone in my position, right? People in my generation, the generation younger than me, we don't think Social Security is going to be around. So use that as a way to kind of push that forward, right? To me, we could scale back Social Security, but not for those people who are about to retire, can't pull the rug out from underneath them. That's not right. But you know what? Extend the time to retirement for me. Cut the benefits for me. I have time to make those adjustments. These are some of those smaller policies that can kind of chip away at that trajectory, not necessarily, an all-encompassing, new program that will suddenly solve the problem. That'll never pass. But putting forth ideas that say, hey, we're going to fix this, but it's going to take a lot of time. It's going to take, we're going to do this to people who can actually make those adjustments, I think is a better a way to go about that policy-wise.
The doors are closing.
Yeah.
That's right. It's a little more than 30 seconds, but you're yelling down the hallway.
Yeah. Pushing the button.
Well, Andrew, Beth, thank you so much. Let's have a round of applause for our panelists, please.
This is fun.
And thanks to all of you for being with us today for the Southern Congressional Series. I want to encourage you, we have a survey, which it is up on the screen, so that QR code, snap a photo of that and follow the link and fill out a brief survey. Give us your feedback on this event and any event in the series. And thank you again for joining us, and thanks to our partners here at Weber State and the Walker Institute for hosting us. So thanks everyone very much.